Welcome to today. I know you're used to starting on a two-shot of me and my guest. My guest is here. We've been chatting away for 20 plus minutes without you. My guest today is Dr. Robert Brooks. You've heard me talk about him a billion times. One of the absolute leading men on topics like resilience, dealing with child development, those sorts of things. And he's got a book that he's written with his colleague, David Richman, called Chasing Positivity, which is why I'm dragging him back into this. It's about Charismatic Advisor, which is a book that he wrote with David way back in 2014 or so. But before I bring in Dr. Brooks, Dr. Robert Brooks, who I always have to remember to call Bob, the nice, strange people at Johnsonville sent me the finest quality sausage box from Johnsonville Brats, just because I tweeted something about how I had not had better cheddars in a very long time. And because we're all eating like stoners, I should say something nice about them. So they sent me coupons, of course. I'm totally down with this. I hope they take these at my little local grocery store. Thanks for the coupons. And then I don't really know what this is. It's 4 pieces of fabric. So I'm going to go with shirts. I got 4 Johnsonville Brats shirts. So my guess is, I'm not going to have to open these right now. My guess is that this is one for every member of the family, especially if they're all my size. So I just wanted to open up. I asked Dr. Brooks if I could do that real quick before I dragged him in. Chloe says, okay, hello. So there. All right. So let me rearrange my screen a little. Let me grab in Dr. Brooks. There he is. He's good looking, isn't he? Dr. Bob Brooks, welcome. Thanks for being part of this today.
Great to be here, Chris.
Oh, so super glad to be here. So my friend Carrie in the comments says you could be found at drrobertbrooks.com. By the way, I have nifty little banners like that myself. You can get more Bob at Dr. Robert Brooks on the tweeters and also drrobertbrooks.com. You have this book that just came out right at the beginning of the coronavirus, because what good timing that is for your book tour. Chasing Positivity. This book starts like I said to you just before I brought you in, chapter 1, page 1. I'm already in a worksheet or something like that. I'm already in a workbook already. Why did I already have homework on page 1 of your book, Doctor?
Well, by the way, you always make me laugh, Chris. So that you really know how to chase positivity. Okay, so I'll give you that compliment. Thank you for having me on. You know, one of the reasons I did it is I want people right away to start thinking about it. You can have a lot of things. I mean, we explained some of it, but sometimes I feel have people start right away reflecting, because you know what it's like for me. I want the book to be very interactive. It's just like I once said to a group who asked me in terms of giving workshops, I said, myself, some of the best workshops I ever attended, I didn't say a word. It was that was so interactive. And they looked at me puzzled, said, you didn't say a word? And I said, no, the reason they were so interactive right away, I couldn't stop thinking of things. And sometimes, the thinking is going to take a couple days before I can even think of the questions. So I don't know if it's to grab people so much as to say, I guess the best way I can say it is, I once said to someone else, if I was speaking and then the fire alarm went off and everyone had to leave the room, even if I was just speaking for 3 minutes, I would want them to think, this is one of the best workshops I've attended. Now, I don't want to sound narcissistic about that, but how do you grab people? But more important is, we were talking about actually before, and we get into in terms of this, not only how you grab people, I always wonder, how do you create an environment, I call them motivating environments, where right away there's this energy, which is more difficult when it's a webinar, but this energy that people are going to want to learn from you, and you're going to really want to teach. And one way to do that is to start engaging people and think about, what would I say? There's a lot of examples. What would you say? And we also mentioned in the book, sometimes what David says, who's, consults with financial advisors and in the financial world, is somewhat different from what I would say. So, we all have different techniques. We wanted right away to have people stop and start to think about the concepts we were going to bring up.
So here's the action item, by the way. Page 1, there's a sentence, and then you get into this, because we're going to talk about intentionality. Well, it's obviously your intention that we think about this right away. So here's how you assess your success with intentionality. Take a few minutes to answer the following questions. Did you meet your goals for new client development over the past 12 months? By the way, no, I did not. I fell short of my expectations to follow on with the yes and no click here. Identify 3 words that you hope existing or prospective clients, colleagues, and centers of influence would use to describe you to someone who doesn't know you. Beautiful first thing. Because I think 2 things when I think that. I think if I read that when I'm depressed, I'm going to write the worst 3 words on those lines. And I think back, boy, what would I want them to say about me? Like when he's not around, oh, that Chris, well, he's pretty creative. That's one. I'll give me that. He seems honest. I don't know the third one, but like that, you're right. That's a starting point. And then you go right into kind of like your take on it and David's take. That back and forth is interesting. How did you decide on that as like a format for how you're going to write this book?
Well, a few things. First of all, the questions I raised is one could raise it even as an author. What words would you hope a reader used to describe you in this book? How empathic do you come across? How informative are you? So certainly it's in that regard, as well. So we want people to think about that. It's the same thing after, like the example I used, after a few minutes, how would you like the audience to describe you? How would you like, anyone to describe you? And when you mentioned intentionality, and then I'll get to the differences we had, intentionality, one of the things, this was really interesting, in separate workshops Dave and I were giving, we were including the word intentionality in our workshops, because it's one thing to say, I want people to see me this way, but what do you intentionally say or do? Like when I've given workshops for teachers, how do you want your students to describe you? What do you intentionally say or do so they're likely to describe you that way? It's in any relationship. The issue of David and I sometimes having different views of what we say is that David sometimes would give an example from the financial world and say, Bob, this is what I often say. I would say to him, David, I hope you don't mind trying to be very empathic, but this is what I would say. And we would have this very respectful dialogue. We worked together. And then at one point he said, what if we put what both of us would say, and even say, there may be disagreements. Think about, what you would feel most comfortable with in terms of the reader. I love that, because I remember even when I was in training as a psychologist, I was always interested in what do people actually say and do? What do you say and do in situations? I welcome theory, Chris, but I was always interested in hearing people's thoughts about what they say and do, because that helped me to start more with saying, you've got to be more intentional, even though I didn't use the word way back then.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of words to chew on here. It's a book. There's a lot of kind of words with a lot of meaning in them to chew on. There's empathy, positivity, collaboration, action. What are the 3 dynamics? And if you had to give someone less than a 3 if you had to give someone a fortune cookie to walk away with and explain what they're supposed to be smart about with chasing positivity, what would that look like? So 3 dynamics and then the fortune cookie.
Okay. Well, to start, the 3 dynamics that we talk in the book are linked to the overall chasing, positivity. And one of the things, just, for listeners to know, positivity really is based on what we call positive psychology. But I became more and more interested in the topic of what do positive emotions really do? Because I started saying we've got to create positive emotions, even in difficult situations. And reading works by Sean Aker and reading works by Barbara Fredrickson, who wrote the book Positivity, and Richard Davidson, who's a neuroscientist, I said, wow, there are things going on here about positivity that now that there's more brain research is fascinating, that parts of the brain are being activated that may not have even been activated before when people feel positive emotions. So one of the things we said is, how then do we create positive emotions from the start? And then we selected things actually that I had been writing about. One was, you've got to be, I don't want to overuse the word empathic, empathy. You really, as much as possible, and it's not always easy, put yourself in the shoes of the other person and see the world through their eyes. That also led to what I call empathic communication, which, having heard you you do beautifully, it's basically asking questions. And anything I say or do, what do I hope to accomplish? But the next question is very important. Am I saying or doing things in a way where the other person will be most likely to hear me? And that is critical. I know people who have best intentions, but right away they say something and the other person becomes defensive. Like, just to give you an example of that, there are ways of disagreeing with someone. And in the book, we talk about this. How do you prepare people to hear a message that they may disagree with, and that they don't get defensive? So one of the techniques, it may sound so simple, is I will often say, I have something to say to you. If you disagree, would you please let me know? It's not a gimmick. It's saying we may disagree, let me know. And that gets to another dynamic, collaboration. People, I don't care, even if they hire you as an advisor, if you just always tell them what to do, it's going to be a problem. We have some expertise, and we talk about this in this book, but the expert is also the person we are working with, whether I'm seeing someone in therapy or consulting with a business leader. So you have to be empathic. The collaboration. Let me know. I even in therapy, I shouldn't say even in therapy, I will say, if there's any question I ever ask you and you don't know why I'm asking, don't answer the question. I think people should know why therapists ask questions. And I'll then say, it's important for me and you to always, that we be on the same wavelength. So we talked about this positivity. We talked about you have to be empathic. And I'm just giving a very quick summary, even though it may seem lengthy. Collaboration is where the other person really feels you're hearing them, that it's really a joint effort here. You're working together. And then the third dynamic is really what we call inspire action. You could, everything could be wonderful, but this used to come up in therapy. What if then the patient doesn't follow through? So here, what if your client doesn't follow through? How do you inspire action? What are some of the things? And this gets to everything from what are the small steps people can take? I saw in therapy sometimes as people were trying to change, one of the big problems was, and I'm sure you face this also in your work, some people, the changes are like just so unrealistic. So I want people to, quote, taste success. What's one small step? Another and another and another. So we basically try to say chasing positivity, or positivity which affects brain development is very important. And then what are the things from day one when you're working with someone that starts to the dynamics, the empathy, collaboration, and then inspiring action. It was just a model as we were talking about what were some of the steps that are involved in the work we do.
It's interesting when you look at the whole idea of action. One of the things that you have to kind of aim for is you've got to, you put these three boxes around it because that's how we talk about it. Like talking about anything kind of cerebral, of course, there's a whole host of other things. Mm-hmm. Was there debate along the way of writing this book? Was there debate to decide these are the three? Or what kind of comes in or out of deciding this is the model we're going to go forward with? Is it easy to decide on that or no?
That is such a wonderful question. I'm laughing because although David said, I think we started planning this book in 2015 or 16, I think it was 2014. And there was a lot of back and forth. And I think we both contributed, but I started to think about from, again, as a psychologist, as a consultant, and I've consulted different organizations, what are some of the things that guide me? So that's where positivity, I said, you know what? People say he's a positive psychologist. I've written a lot about positivity. As you know, one of my main areas of interest has been resilience, what helps people to bounce back. And I say, so in all my other papers and my talks, what are the things I really emphasize? And, I use that concept of motivating environments. I said, you got to be empathic. You have to collaborate. It started to influence the questions. And also, as a psychologist, I felt, what good is it if people are not inspired to take action, don't, have the courage? So we would go back and forth that way. And it's interesting because David in his field uses the word inertia. You have to help clients overcome inertia. As a psychologist, we use the word resistance. Of course, I also, although not everyone agreed, I used to say resistance is as much a part of what a patient brings in it as what you do as a therapist. Why is it that with some some patients or I'll put it more from the therapist viewpoint, some therapists have far fewer resistant patients than others. I kid about this. I said, in the beginning of my career, all my patients were resistant. Somehow I must have gotten better, patients along the way. So it's a very interesting thing what you bring up, because this probably book took longer to write than any other, but most of it was planning, back and forth, ideas thrown back and forth. I knew at some point it was going to happen, in that regard, Chris, but it's part of that process, which I'm sure when you're writing your books, it's the same way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, there could be 8 Beatles when I start my band, but there's only going to be the 3 when I'm done, right? So I was fascinated with what you just said, and I did that awful, awful mistake of floating off into that makes me think instead of listening. And I heard you. But I vividly had to tell you something because of what you said, especially the way you worded it was so brilliantly. But I had so many more resistant patients when I was starting out. I had a guy challenge me right when I started launching this story leader stuff, because, by the way, anyone with story anything in their business name hates me now and wants to show me why they're so much better than me. And I'm always like, you probably are. Like, I have no resistance. Like, sure. And so this guy, though, the one thing he said, and I really love this, I loved almost nothing else he said, one mistake in the way you explained building your own personal story. So one mistake you made was that you can't have the whole thing fully formed. Stories are a collaboration. Stories, you have to bring enough of your story forward that the other person feels like they can be part of it. And now you're kind of doing this dance. And when you said that about resistance, when you said about like what a good psychologist is or isn't, a bad psychologist from the patient side is one that comes with their steamroller ready to push you through their regime, and kind of push you right all the way through. As opposed to, I'm here to learn, like, T. Barry Brazelton, and, the parent is always the biggest expert in the room of their own kid. I feel like that is so central to what you're saying in this, with the collaboration part, with the empathy part, and that you only get to action when the person feels like they're already past some of their resistance to go downhill.
Well, I'm glad whatever you were thinking, I'm glad you went to that, because you just summarized very nicely in that regard. First of all, when you're with someone else, it has to become as much their story as your story. I should mention, I love stories. Years ago, some of my first publications were the use of storytelling in therapy with both kids and adults. Very powerful in metaphors. And when I've heard you speak, you're great at that. People remember that. People always remember stories. So, a matter of fact, sometimes I'll give a talk. Someone say, I heard you 10 years ago. Were you going to tell this story? And that helps them remember the points. But what you're also bringing up, which is so wonderful, and it really reminds me of people I've seen in therapy, is in the storytelling technique I developed, I always say, you can start helping to create it, but you better make sure the patient is filling in things, because the story has to be about them. I realize doing therapy may be a little different than other relationships, but the same with advising. You may have a certain story, you fill it in. You should be thinking, is this story helping the process of, our relationship? But the more they help to create that story, because there's another story going on. That's why I loved your point, is there's the story we're creating of our relationship with this particular person at this point. Every patient I saw, I had a different story with, whether it was a 5-year-old or a 60-year-old. And so I'm not going to have the same story there. So, when I've heard you speak, you create a story with your audience, the audience members take, with anyone you advise. So it's a joint process. And I just want to emphasize that, because it really has to do with collaboration. It has to do with respect. And I don't want to just throw these words around, but it's very powerful.
Very kind of you. And sales expert Jack Vincent, who runs Story Warrior, doesn't hate me, but he also said,
I was seeing a comment here. Yeah,
let the patient fill in the story, let the prospect fill in the story. Co-ownership, and that's true of sales, right? A really good sales experience is never, have I got the lawnmower for you? It's like, tell me a little bit about this lawn. What kind of terrain are we conquering out there? What do we have to go after? What's the hill like?
Mm-hmm.
Because you sell somebody a super heavy non-self-propelled mower, and you got one of those good old steep hills, and that person's going to have a good trip to the gym every single time they push that mower around. They're not going to love it. So it's everything has that collaboration. I mean, Rob Van Winkle, who's a sort of more modern philosopher, he said, stop and collaborate and listen. And his opinion was that, you know, if there's no collaboration, then you can't really get to the point of listening. So.
And you know what's interesting when you say that? Every one of us would say collaboration is important, empathy is important, you know, inspiring action. But what it really brings up is importance is really is that how does one do this? That's why getting back to intentionality, what does one intentionally say and do? Well, you know, certainly you're inviting other people in there, but one has to think very intentionally. What does one say or do at these moments? How does one create positive emotions? And it's going to be different for everyone. And that's why when you started with intentionality, I think in our fields, we have to be very flexible, but we have to be intentional.
Utterly so.
Yeah.
Deborah's here chilling out. She says, I love some of the listening skills that Chris Voss teaches that help with this. The participant gets to feel heard and want to share more. Chris is the world's leading hostage negotiator, now switching those skills over to business, wherein which I often feel like I've been kept hostage. He's done a fine job of really pivoting his business that way. And in this way, that's the kind of fun about you is, I mean, there's psychology in everything, of course. And, you know, a lot of your books early on were like pure psychology reads. But as you come to realize, there's such a business application for being being Bob Brooks. And so there's all these opportunities that you can go out and explain what your wealth of experience can motivate and inspire and educate these people to understand. You might get through business a little better if you give these things a shot. When you speak to business audiences, what's the difference than when you speak to audiences in a slightly more clinical setting?
Well, you know, such a wonderful question. On that, one time a psychologist came to hear me speak at a business, you know, friend, and you know what he said afterwards? He said, the examples you used were from more the business world, but the principles were the same. And they really were. So if one heard me like, if I took three kinds of speaking to parents and speaking to teachers and say speaking to business leaders, I'll just make that up. The basic philosophy or model I have is the same. Teachers want kids to want to create motivating environments where kids will learn from them. So they have to develop a relationship. That's why my workshops for teachers, I mentioned before, I immediately say, write down how you hope your students describe you and what words will you actually use. With business leaders, what words do you hope your clients or your customers or your staff will use to describe you? What do you intentionally do? Parents, I love it. I say, take a sheet of paper. One column, write down all the words you hope your kids will use to describe you. Second column, what do you intentionally say or do so they're likely to use these words? And I'm laughing because at one workshop, a woman shouted out, I love when people just shout out, don't go any further. I see where this is leading. Because the third question is, what words do you think they would actually use? And that's not always easy. And we sometimes don't know, but that's another question, in relation to that. And it is, you know what, Chris, I don't want to simplify it, but people are people everywhere. And as a matter of fact, one group of financial advisors I spoke with, I did a workshop with David. I said, I've never seen someone take such copious notes as with financial advisors. We got very specific about dialogue. And David said to me, a lot of them have not really had that such specific training, and they're very eager to learn in that regard. And all I could think of was when I was a beginning therapist, that, as I said, I wanted to know, I may not agree, but what do people actually say and do in certain situations? And, to return a compliment, the first time I heard you was at my son, Rich's talk, and I went up to you afterwards, and I heard a great deal about it. I said, basically something like, that was very psychological, and your talks were very psychological, but you brought in the human factor. You brought in empathy. You may have used some different words than I would, but it just so resonated. And I think it's just very powerful that way. But it was fun for me actually to start speaking to different audiences and have that possibility to do it, and to then have an opportunity to write a couple of books more for a business and financial audience.
watching that shift has been kind of fun in that way. I mean, look, there's so much you've got to still share with the clinical world and all that, but it's a lot of, like I explained about religion. A lot of the best church doesn't have a steeple or anything else flying over it. There's you get a lot of preaching outside the synagogue as well. So, some of my favorite preachers literally have all the theology degrees you could ever imagine. They never flex them once. They never quote a verse of any particular sacred text. And I learned so much more from that person because I don't come with my resistance to you and your dumb book, because I'm suddenly like, I'm participating in the story, like we said. So I do. People are people everywhere. This is, from Chloe in Scotland, by the way.
Chloe in Scotland. Thank you.
Carol in Montreal says bonjour. So, so one of the things that, as you were talking, and by the way, thank you very much for the compliment. I'm horrendous at receiving compliments, but I appreciate that one a lot. I take a little bit of pride in it. The other thing I've always taught in business is just that there's always someone who's going to teach you the tools. Every stage in the world wants to say, let me show you this cool thing you could do with email marketing. But like you pointed out in the financial setting, there's a lot of business leadership that sounds like this. The boss says, go figure this out. And you go, got it. And then you leave. And then that was the training. And you're like, oh, I guess that was my training. And so your point about like giving actual instruction, so many people I made fun of the fact that your book on page 1 makes me do work, but so much in education is really, it's lacking even a template to start from. Like we talked about the model of what you put to make your book, your 3 dynamics. Everything lacks that just basic starter kit. How do you help people find it when you didn't write the book? How do you help people find it out in the wild, so to speak, that starter kit?
Well, it's very interesting because I smile easily. For some reason, you bring out the smile on me easily. We have to discover our own starter kits anyway. It's nice if we have, I agree, a certain template. Part of it was with me was, I hate to say it, in trial and error. I mean, one of the turning points in my career, which led me to start look at the positive, was when I headed a locked door inpatient child and adolescent unit at a psychiatric hospital. I burned out after 3-4 months. I thought I'd worked with tough kids before. And when I realized, and now looking back, Chris, I could put labels on it, I created negative emotions because my mind said, well, these kids have to know who's boss. And one kid educated me quickly and said, you don't get it, do you, Brooks? We're going to outlast you. Now, I wish I knew, way back then when I first took that job, what I know now. But then I say, but you know what? It was a turning point. Because it was at that point that I started saying, I don't care. All people have assets or strengths. And as you know, from my other books, I call them islands of competence.
Right.
So I learned the hard way. So I said, what would happen if when a patient came in to see me, parents about their kid or adults about their own life, after 10 minutes, I said, now that I've heard about a few of the problems, can you tell me what you see as your interests or passions or islands of competence? It was amazing to me. By the way, some, I have to pause. Some immediately said, I can't think of any. And I remember my first thought almost was to say, I'm trying to develop a strength-based model. You've got to be more cooperative. And then I said, they really can't. So what I would say is, would you like to? Or and I would explain why I think it's important. As we were talking before the show, little did I know years later, we were to learn that if you create some of that positivity, it helps people to really want to share more with you, to be better problem solvers. It actually promotes, brain development there. So in one sense, all of us, you do it too, we share our experiences to hopefully make it easier for someone else. They're going to have to learn anyway. But I also say, being interested in resilience, there are going to be some experiences no book is going to teach you. There's going to be no template. Like I had, at one of my first jobs in that psychiatric hospital. But I look back, it was very painful at the time. I thought about resigning several times. And I said, but you know what? That experience really planted the seeds for a much more strength-based model, looking for islands of competence and things like that. But I think your work, hopefully mine, anyone's work, if we can share it, hopefully people will take from that what they find will be most helpful and useful in their work. I'm
thinking through you versus that room. and versus when it starts, right? And I'm thinking about, you know, having, it's really it. Like that whole that microcosm is what we face in so many different levels and variations, right? You know, we're the boss of a business, or we know some things we know, and we come against a client who says something in a way that sets us off, or we come against a client that makes us question our capacity and our capability, and we're suddenly on that back foot. We're like, oh man, I've got to like really apply what little expertise I think I have. And you start questioning it. Like you can pick the rails that you're going to go off that cliff on, and you can grease them compared to, all right, what should I do? I should be looking for this. I should be looking for that. You know, I feel like even if there's not always a book for, is there something here? Watch this. Here comes this. Can we put something in our backpack for later, Dr. Brooks, that would make us think about when I'm in that moment, when I feel like I'm up against that room full of, locked unit kids, where do I even start to get, leaning forward again? And what do I do next?
Wow. What a, that's a very
roughie, I know.
Therapeutic kind of question. As we get, quotes, more mature in our lives, whatever that may mean, or more experience, of course, we can then fall back on some of the successes and previous difficulties. And in my therapy work, I will always, your question triggered several different things. So I'm going to answer in a few different ways. I hope. One of the things that you've been, and you know what the intruding thought was, I'll share it with you. To this day, here I've written all these books about positivity and resilience. I give a workshop. I look at the evaluations. 49 out of the 50 people in the workshop say, this was really excellent. And then there's one that says, I don't even know why I bothered to come today. I hate to admit this, but I know people focus on. Why do I think about that one? What did I do wrong? What this? And then what I have to do, but see, I say, well, wait a second. Most got something out of it, in that particular regard. So one of the things is we get, as we have more experiences, it's easier to fall back. And I tell people, think about those situations you faced, you were able to cope with. And what did you learn from that? As a matter of fact, and this is a little scattered, your question triggered so much. There's a wonderful thing in basically solution-focused therapy, called the exception rule. And I use this a lot in therapy or in my consultations. If someone says, I'm never successful at this, or I never do a good job, whatever, or parents say my kid is always obnoxious, this was an actual example, I'll say, can you think about one time you were successful? Can you think about one time your kid was cooperative? It's not to deny that there's problems, but sometimes what I love about the exception rule, and most people can tell you about an exception, is what can we learn from that rule? Not to force positivity on you, but what can we learn? The other thing that I've incorporated more and more in my consultation and therapy had to do with the following. I didn't think I was preparing myself, or that's why your question triggered a lot, or my clients or patients for setbacks. In your office, so I had the most brilliant ideas in my office with my clients or patients, but they don't always work. And I found then people sometimes got more upset with me or with them. Some would actually say, see, it works for other people, not me. It was at that point that I started to think about something we had briefly mentioned, I think, before we went on it. How do you prepare people for mistakes, intentionally prepare them? Right. And this is part of the book here. So I started saying, this sounds great, but what if it doesn't work? But I would immediately say, what's backup plan A or B or C? So what we're saying is, it's not a self-fulfilling prophecy for failure, but instead what it really is you're saying to people, some things don't work, but we learn from it. But then I read a book, Gabrielle Oettingen, if that's how it's pronounced, called Rethinking Positive Thinking. And it dovetailed with my thinking, but she said it in a more elaborate way, and she had research. What she would bring up after you develop goals and strategies, she would then say, okay, what are possible obstacles you're going to face? And what are ways of overcoming them? It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But so what you're doing is, there's a concept I use in my work, personal control, which is very important with everything that's going on in the world. Focus on what you have control over. So if a person has goals and certain strategies, but if they can anticipate some of the obstacles, we can't anticipate all of them. Then you also say, how will you cope? How will you feel? How will you cope? This person feels a greater sense of personal control. So if an obstacle appears, then even if it wasn't one they anticipated, but they have different ways of coping. I talk a lot about coping strategies. They feel more in control. They feel they have in their backpack these strategies that they didn't know they necessarily were going to need, but they actually do. So, again, as we're talking, it's almost like I'm looking at my career, what were the things that almost forced me to say, I've got to build in the possibility of things not working. And then what's always lovely is when you do it intuitively and then you find someone's doing research with a research model and wonderful research findings in that regard. So I always say, whether you're consulting, you're advising someone, doing therapy, with teachers in the classrooms, how do you help kids anticipate mistakes and deal with them? That is a very powerful thing, because what you want to do is you don't want to immediately have that knee-jerk reaction. See, I'm not very smart, or I wish I had a better therapist or a better advisor, or whatever the case may be. So your question triggered a lot. I hope I wasn't too scattered all over.
Well, so earlier I had to admit to you that I lost my train of thought because I started thinking about my own stuff. This time I was like the shittiest interviewer in the world, because I was just like, tell me more, Dr. Brooks. And I just like had nothing ready to go for the next question. These 2 sentences are me prepping for a third question. I do have a question though. I can't find this. I looked on Amazon. Help me out.
Yeah, what happened, and it's a long story. Right now, it's only available through my website.
So drrobertbrooks.com.
Yeah. It's a long story in terms of our because David works at Eaton Vance. I'm not even going to get into all of it. But the first book also was basically available through the through the website. So I know someone else said that, but we'll try, it just really came out a couple months ago. It's very unusual because all my other books are available at Amazon. I tell people just get it to Amazon, but it is available on my website. It just has to do with the relationship we have with David's firm.
His gang. I got it.
Okay.
Say no more. We've triggered Deborah in a positive way. She says, wow, it's also normalizing the idea of setbacks so that we don't have to take it personally and it becomes a positive experience. Wow, I anticipated something like this, so I'm not blindsided.
Beautiful comment, a really lovely description. And that's what people have said. When I first attempted to say, what if it doesn't work, or those words, I really struggled with it, because I said, you're bringing up a self-fulfilling prophecy for failure. As a matter of fact, some of my patients would even say, why are you even bringing up it may not work? And because I said, because sometimes things don't work, even though we've planned them. So let's think of what our backup plan is, in that regard. So, I really struggled with it until I tried it a little. I said, what do you have to lose? Let's see. And I explained it to patients, collaboration. I would even say to people, do you know why I'm bringing this up? And I would directly say, some people think I may have a self-fulfilling prophecy for failure. You know what I've more and more felt? If there are elephants in the room, you better bring them up. Because if not, people are going to have certain ideas that you have not addressed and will not be very helpful.
So in business, I've been explaining that a lot lately. And what I've been saying is that there's sort of a mental emotional tax we put. Like if I bring you into my office at 4 p.m. on a Friday and I start the conversation by asking, how are you doing? What you are only thinking is, I'm fired, I'm fired, I'm fired, I'm fired, I'm fired. If I say, yeah, isn't it a beautiful day out? I'm still fired. I'm pretty sure I'm fired. And until I say I'm not firing you, that's all you're thinking. You're producing dopamine. Like there's a chemical flood in there that's saying, I'm not ready to think. I got to run now. Thanks. And you might have just been saying, listen, on Monday, can we start on this new project? And nothing's coming of that. Nothing good. So I hear that what you're saying. Chloe says, sometimes we forget to do the simple work that gives us a solid foundation and prepares us for anything. I think that's very true. I think it's an accurate way to look at it. And part of that foundational work, it turns out, is you really got to think about what doesn't happen, when it doesn't happen. I'm curious to know, I want to do one quick thing really here. So Carrie is not only just Carrie in the comments, she's a host of several very successful shows herself, also graduated top of her class as a lawyer. And so she rushed out and started bit.ly/chasing positivity. So you now have an actual simple, easy link you can share anywhere on the planet. Oh, cortisol. Yeah, sorry. Dopamine's the one that makes you feel good as you're trying to be messed up. Sorry. Thanks, druggie.
I
Chloe
don't know why
says,
you make me laugh so much, Chris.
I know, I'm sorry. That's the dopamine.
It's great. Hey,
so
you create positive emotions. It's very easy to be interviewed by you. So thank you. I'm
Right,
sorry.
well, thank you. It's a drug, but not cortisol. So I actually have to look a little bit more about the fight. The flight part, fight or flight, man. Sorry, where I was in that concept though about sort of self-fulfilling prophecy and all that. There's probably some really awesome, several people have written books about a thing that I don't know what it's called, but I like to say a lot that we accidentally treat people a little bit like our own personal puppet show. Like we know what we want and we really want them to do what we want as well. That kind of mind control power. I assume there's some phenomena name for that. And that is one of those ways that you set yourself up for failure.
Yeah, well, we could give a diagnosis. Some people are very narcissistic. That's their whole day.
What? Yes. That's probably accurate.
I don't want to sound too much like a psychologist, but there are some people who feel I know what's best and I'm just going to tell you. And, sometimes if they really do feel that particular way, they don't collaborate. And I don't want to mention, but some people get rid of people who disagree with them.
Yeah, they do. Some of them.
Yeah, I don't want to mention anything. So some people do that. And, it's very sad because, the way one learns is really, you want people who have differing opinions at times. You want a kid to tell you it's in the psychiatric hospital, you don't get it, Brooks, we're going to outlast you. Because you have to then really sit back and say, they are going to outlast me. They're already, what do I do differently? Not what they do differently.
Right.
I can do that. That gets to that whole notion of personal control. What is it that I have to do differently to engage this client or this patient? What is it I have to do differently, as a teacher so that I engage a class? Not what they're going to do differently. But that's really, I hate to overuse the word empowering. It's empowering. That's why I use the term in my resilience books about personal control. And what do
personal control is the right phrasing. It's interesting because as you were talking about, I jumped over your side. I stepped on you because
no, don't worry.
I was thinking Dr. Stephen Covey and his stupid habit one, which is absolutely true. Once you realize you're the guy driving the ship, you said, it's not what they're doing, it's what I'm doing. What do I do to pick it back up? That's habit one stuff. I learned that in the protoplasm of that in the late 80s. And it's totally the right question all the time. He said this thing and, what I love most about Covey is he basically just, reamed a whole bunch of other people's books and made a nice new cover and called it his. He says that in all of his presentations up until he dies. He's like, this isn't mine. I stole it all. And he said, the main thing is to make the main thing the main thing. That's one of his things. The other is anytime you think the problem is outside of yourself, that thought itself is the problem. You must like simultaneously like thank and want to squeeze Dr. Covey in those ways.
His book, The 7 Habits is an excellent, really book. And you're right. You know what? Just like my books and so, some are simple principles. There's some that some people say they didn't think about before, but we now know that expressing gratitude is tied to resilience. Enriching the lives of others gives purpose and meaning to our lives. We've known that, but we know it's just these things are very important. But some of the most unhappy people I've seen, Chris, are people who are looking for their happiness by someone else changing first. And once that happens, if only my wife were nice, if only my husband, if only this, if only I had a better boss, and some of this is true. But once you at that, one almost develops what I hate to overuse this, a victim mentality. Yeah. That's why personal control is, what is it I can do differently at this particular point to bring about some of the change I want? Just very quickly, one of my favorite exercises I'll often do is I'll say to people, write down 3 things you want to see different in your life. Next to it, put down whether someone else has to change first for you to realize that. Because I say, here's free therapy. If I'm doing a workshop, if you're looking for your happiness by someone else changing first, you can have a tough time being happy. You have to look at what you have to change.
I don't have anything else. I can't do it. Sorry, Your Honor. Witness, I guess. Dr. Robert Brooks, he wants you to call him Bob. I can't do it. Oh my gosh, professional mentalist and sword swallower Roderick Russell joins us late.
Oh, I saw him at Rich's.
Yes, you did.
I saw him at Rich's conference.
Exactly.
Isn't
He's
he
legendary because
Yeah.
some of the most unhappy people I've noticed are people looking for happiness. Now I have to tell you a really quick Roderick Russell story because you'll appreciate it because of the entire storyline we just had. Roderick Russell is the most knowledgeable person I know about coffee. I went out with him in Portland for coffee at Rich's thing and realized I don't know anything about coffee because the way he asked somebody at the counter some questions, I realized I'm just a pedestrian. Like, I know nothing. So I called him the other day because I just had a passing question is cold brew coffee like stupid? That was the question. Like, I make it at my house now, but I feel stupid. Like, I feel like I'm just putting a bunch of cold, wet beans in the fridge and pretending it's coffee, and maybe it's not even, and maybe it's dumb. He goes on, he goes, I don't know. And as two guys who don't know anything, of course, we research it and come up with a good answer. And he says, no, it turns out you might actually be, onto something because cold brew saves some of the elements of coffee. He made me feel good. It was positive thinking, positive intentionality. I left thinking my foremost expert, Roderick Russell, mentalist and sword swallower, coffee expert, said, Brogan, you're good because you like cold brew coffee. I win. So that's a good note, right? That's a great note to end on, Dr.
It
Brooks.
is. I mean, you know what? It's even though I could write a book about chasing positivity, is you do things, you're not always sure what it'll bring you, and you hope it's going to bring some happiness. But if your whole goal is just to be happy, that's why a lot of people have taken at issue this whole notion, just like it used to be, have self-esteem, have happiness, because also a whole other topic at some point is chasing positivity does not mean ignoring when you're sad, when you're anxious, or whatever. It means being able to more honestly look at that and look at how to deal with it. And some people think looking for happiness is that you ignore that. No, you have to deal with those things. They're part of our lives. So I appreciate his comment.
What an end save to the whole storyline. Bob Brooks, thank you so much. I'm always honored to be in your presence. Thanks for coming on today and catching up.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.